Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading. The World is Swept Away. September 24, 2003. Every now and then you read a piece taking the Buddha to task on the first of the three characteristics. The thrust of the piece usually is, "What's wrong with change? Change is a good thing. If it weren't for change, we wouldn't have happiness. There would be no art in the world, no music, no literature. All the things that make life enjoyable, they say, come from change. So what's wrong with it? You have to look at change in The first of the summaries has to do with inconstancy. The world is swept away, it does not endure. This, on its own, may not be a bad thing. Certain things getting swept away would not be bad for the world. But then, Rathabhala illustrates his point with aging. When King Karavu was young, he was so strong he felt that he had the strength of two people. But now he's 80 years old and, as he says, "I think I'll put my foot one place, and I end up putting it someplace else." We don't even have that much control when aging comes. Change can be nice when it's well handled, but when you think of all the beautiful music in the world, think of all the lousy music, too. People actually make an effort to write lousy music. Not that they intend it to be lousy, but it's very difficult to write good music, create good art, write great literature. If change were a good thing in and of itself, good literature would be easy to write, good paintings easy to paint. But these things are hard. It takes an awful lot of skill to make change happy. And even with people who are very skilled at it, what happens to them over time? They grow older. As they grow older, all kinds of indignities come to them. The body can't function, and when the body can't function, they can't entertain people as they used to. They get less control over themselves, their bowel movements, their memory, their minds, less and less control over their relationships. It's a pretty sad state of affairs. Think of the misery suffered by Beethoven, Brahms, and Mozart as they approach death. That kind of change is inevitable. It's built into the way things are. If you think about it, you realize that the change we try to create through art, literature, music goes against the way things are. Works of art and literature have a nice beginning, they build up a little tension, but then it's nicely released at the end. There's a sense of completion, a sense of coming to a satisfying goal. But life isn't like that. At the end of life, everything gets disjointed and simply falls to pieces. That moves into the next Dhamma summary. The world offers no shelter, there's no one in charge. Rathabhala illustrates this with the fact of illness. He asks the king, "Do you have a recurring illness?" And the king answers, "Yes, I have a wind illness," which in those days meant sharp, shooting pains going through the body, and he adds that when he has an attack, all his courtiers and relatives hang around saying, "Maybe he'll die now, maybe he'll die now." They might be saying this out of fear, or out of hope. Some of them might want him out of the way so that they can grab power. So Rathabhala asks the king, "Can you ask those friends, courtiers, and relatives who are hanging around to please share out some of your pain?" The king replies, "No, of course not. Not even a king can ask other people to share out the pain that comes with illness." This illustrates the second of the three characteristics, the stress and suffering that come along with change. In other words, the natural change of the body. When you're in pain, you have to suffer it on your own. Then the third characteristic, of not self. The world has nothing of its own, one has to pass on, leaving everything behind. The king has lots of wealth all stored up, and of course, he has a strong sense that it's his own wealth. But when he dies, he won't be able to take it with him. He's got to leave it behind. That's the ultimate not self teaching. Even your body, your feelings, your perceptions, your thought constructs, your consciousness. You can't take those with you, either. These first 3 Dhamma summaries provide an interesting point to reflect on, that the Buddha's teaching on the 3 characteristics may have come from the simple facts of aging, illness, and death. Aging, inconstancy, illness, stress and suffering, and death, not self. The 4th Dhamma summary shows why those 3 characteristics are so threatening. The world is insufficient, insatiable, a slave to craving. There's never enough. No matter what you create in this world, there's never a sense of true completion. Even the sense of the completion that comes at the end of a piece of nice music, the end of a good novel, a good book, is false. Aside from awakening, there's never a point where all your problems in life are settled, where there's nothing more to do. There's always a lot more to do. As long as there's craving, there's still an underlying sense of dis-ease and discontent in life. You keep looking for other works of art, other music to create that sense of completion, but they just can't provide it. Rathapala illustrates this 4th summary by asking the king, even though you already reign over a very prosperous country here, suppose someone were to come to you and say, there's a country to the east with lots of wealth, but, in terms of its military strength, it's weak enough that you could conquer it, given the forces you have. Would you conquer it? The king says, of course. Suppose someone were to come from the west with the same news? Well, I'd conquer the kingdom to the west. The north, the south? I'd conquer the kingdoms to the north and south. It's unending. What if someone were to come and say, there's a country on the other side of the ocean? Well, the king would send his forces there, too. It's not the case you satisfy desire and craving by giving into your desires and cravings. You simply make them hungrier for more. It becomes more and more habitual that once there's a craving, once there's a desire, you've got to satisfy it. And when you think of how things are inconstant, stressful, and not self, and how you yourself are subject to aging, illness and death, there's no end to it all. There's never a point of satisfaction. Even death doesn't put an end to things. The Buddha says that we travel on through the craving. Just as wind can carry a flame from a burning house to another house and set the second house on fire, he says, craving carries us over from one lifetime to the next. What's interesting is that the Buddha says all this inconstancy, stress and not self, is rooted in desire. And yet because of the desire we're never satisfied. It's through our lack of satisfaction that we want this and want that, and yet the things that we create in order to fill up that lack never really give satisfaction. So we desire more. We create more. The process keeps feeding on itself, but it can never make itself full. All that work, and yet it can't bring us to a point of completion. That's the ordinary way of the world. No matter how good change gets, no matter how skilled you are at riding the waves of change, it's never enough. That's why the Buddha advises us to look elsewhere for true happiness. And what he does is to tell us to take that craving and try to manage it wisely. In other words, that thirst of craving basically wants as much happiness as possible, as quickly as possible, and with as little effort as possible. But to develop discernment, he says, you take that desire for happiness and adjust it a bit. What could we do to give rise to true happiness, long-lasting happiness, a happiness that wouldn't change? In this way you take your desire, you take the possibility of change, and you turn it into a path that leads beyond, that finally does lead to a point of completion, a point of total satisfaction, what many of the Thai Ajahns call the land of enough. That's what we're doing as we're practicing here. We're trying to take that craving and turn it into something wise, use it wisely. This desire that the Buddha said lies at the root of all things, the root of all dhammas. Dhammas here means any phenomena of any kind, but it can also mean what we think of Dhamma with a capital D, the Dhamma that leads us out, the Dhamma of practice. There has to be a desire underlying the practice. If you're going to walk across the room, you've got to have the desire to get to the other side. The question is how to use that desire in a skillful way. Walking across the room is not a big issue, but the issue of desire in the practice is a lot more subtle, a lot more intricate. We want the desire that impels us along the path, but we don't want it to be so overwhelming that it gets in the way. We need desire to be focused on this one issue. What can we do that gives rise to long-lasting happiness, and ultimately, a happiness that doesn't give rise to change at all? That's what we're working on here. Wherever we may be in the practice right now, that's the general direction we're heading. That's the question that underlies everything we do. But to make sure that the desire doesn't overwhelm us, we have to refocus it on the practice, on the individual steps that will take us where we want to go. So look at the particulars of what you're doing, in terms of your thoughts, words, and deeds, not only while you're sitting here meditating, but also in the whole course of the day. What habits do you have that get in the way of long-lasting happiness? Your habits in terms of dealing with yourself, dealing with other people, how you manage the day, where you devote your time, the intensity in which you focus on what you're doing. All of this is part of the practice. These are things you can look at. And this is important. All the things the Buddha teaches are things we can actually look at. He wasn't a mystifier. He didn't make anything into a big mystery. He said that everything you need to know is right in front of your eyes. The problem is that you're looking past it. So look very carefully at your intentions, right here. I was reading today a blurb for a book on Buddhist ethics, in which the author was proposing that the precepts are too simple-minded, because our actions have so many ramifications that morality should be seen as a big world of mystery. What the author is doing is to take the mystery and confusion the Buddha removed from our lives and put it back in. What does mystery do aside from providing a convenient hiding place for the defilements? So do your best to clear away the mystery by looking right at what you're doing. If you look very carefully at your intentions, you can see whether they're skillful by the mental qualities that underlie them. Then you stay right there and act on that insight. Is there anger motivating your thoughts, words, and deeds? Is there greed? Delusion? If there are these things, don't act on them. Keep your focus right here. This way the process of change in your life becomes something you can manage more and more skillfully. Don't lose sight of what's right here, because everything you need to know to attain true awakening, to discover that happiness beyond change, is right here in your body and mind. The process of sitting right here with the mind on the breath, thinking about and evaluating the breath, perceiving and feeling the results. All the factors you're going to need to know are right here, and yet you tend to look past them. So try to keep your focus right here. The irony of it all is that the more right here you are in your focus, the longer term the happiness that comes from your actions. As you get more and more skillful at this one point, it has ramifications that go out in all directions. The process of change is something that's happening right here. Learn to master it right here. Instead of becoming the change that leads to more and more stress and suffering, to more separations, to a greater sense of dissatisfaction, you turn it around. You take that craving and you tame it by focusing it right here. The more right here you are, the longer the good results will last. You give up the guesswork and speculation, you focus on things you can really know right here, right now. That's why the Buddha's teachings are for everybody. Think about it. Most of the great Ajahns in Thailand came from peasant families. That was back in the days when the Thai government was very proud of what it was doing to Buddhism. It was straightening out Buddhism, it was restructuring everything, starting from the top down, for the sake of the nation-state. But that didn't have nearly the effect, the long-term beneficial effect, that the actions of a few peasant sons had out there in the boondocks, out there in the woods, focusing on things they could know for themselves right therein. Their own thoughts, words, and deeds. Those were the ones who had the biggest impact, the most long-term and deepest impact on keeping the Dhamma alive, not only in Thailand, but around the world. So given the way the whole process of change and causality operates in this world, the more careful you are about what you do and say and think in the immediate present, the better the long-term results are going to be. Instead of trying to satisfy your desires for happiness within the world of change, you take that world of change and use it to attain the changeless. Look directly right here, right now, at every movement of craving so that you can take it apart. Why is there craving for this thing that changes? What can be done to channel it properly? What can be done to put it to an end? That's what the teaching on the 3 characteristics is about. That's why the Buddha keeps reminding us about aging, illness, and death, because otherwise we tend to get contented with this, that, and the other thing. This seems to be okay, that seems to be okay, this is good enough in the practice. But that 4th summary reminds you that it's never enough until you get to the deathless. Only then will there be a true sense of enough. That's where the craving finally disbands. So this is why we keep chanting these passages again and again about aging, illness, death, and separation. The world is swept away. It does not endure. It offers no shelter. There's no one in charge. It has nothing of its own. One has to pass on, leaving everything behind. The world is insufficient, insatiable, a slave to craving. It all sounds pretty negative, but it has a positive import. To remind us not to settle for less than the best. Instead of being depressing, these teachings are liberating. They remind us not to look in the wrong place, not to weigh ourselves down with expectations that can never lead to true happiness at all. Instead, they remind us to look in the right place, where ultimately all worlds disband and the happiness of the deathless can be found. So, even though the teachings may sound negative, they have a very positive aim. Mature strategies. July 29, 2004. Try to get comfortable. Sit with your back comfortably straight. If you're bending over, it's going to put a lot of pressure on your back. And be comfortable with your breath. Find the breath sensations in the body that feel comfortable and stick with them. Allow them to stay there, undisturbed. As that sense of comfort begins to grow, be careful not to get sucked into it too much. Try to maintain your mindfulness and your alertness so that the mind doesn't start drifting off. That's one of our problems. We get a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of comfort, and we let go, wallowing in the pleasure, forgetting where we are, forgetting what we're doing. As a result, the pleasure goes away because the causes for keeping it there get dropped. The mindfulness, the alertness, the ardency of your effort to stick with it weaken. And when they weaken, so does the pleasure. So try to stay alert. As soon as there's a sense of pleasure, try to be aware of the whole body, letting the pleasure seep through the body, and keep that awareness going. You'll find that it's not as easy as it sounds because the mind has a habitual tendency to shrink. Keep reminding yourself. Whole body breathing in, whole body breathing out. And the amount of mindfulness and alertness that are required to keep that whole body awareness going will keep you awake, keep you alert as long as you maintain them. This is one very immediate, very visceral way of showing goodwill to yourself, providing yourself with a sense of pleasure and ease. When you think about it, just about everything we do is based on the pleasure principle, trying to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering. We come to the meditation because we've found that other ways, other strategies for pursuing the pleasure principle haven't worked or are not working to our satisfaction. This is why the Buddha points his teachings at the issue of suffering and the end of suffering. These are the big issues in our lives, and there's a lot of bewilderment surrounding them. As the Buddha said, our reaction to suffering is 1, bewilderment, and 2, a search for someone to show us a way out. This is why the Buddha put so much emphasis on who you hang around with, who you associate with, who you look to for your advice, because they can set you on the right path to the end of suffering, or they can set you on wrong paths winding in all kinds of directions. This is why you have to be very careful. We'd like to think that all paths lead up to the top of the same mountain, but I don't know any mountain in the world where that principle works. The path to the top of Palomar doesn't lead to the top of Everest. And there are a lot of paths on each mountain slope that lead away from the top of the mountain. Some led you over a cliff. So we have to be very careful about which path we choose. The same is true with the old idea that all rivers lead to the ocean. They don't all lead to the ocean. Think of the rivers that end up in Great Basin. They just dry up. The water will evaporate and form clouds, and maybe someday fall down in the catchment basin of another river that will flow to the ocean, but that can take a lot of time. So you have to be careful about who you hang around with and what kind of strategies you employ for a lasting happiness. The Buddha said that this is the beginning of wisdom. When you find wise people, you ask them, "What can I do that will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness?" Then you reflect on their answers. You compare them to the strategies you've been pursuing, and you see what's worth giving a try. Most of our strategies work to some extent. If they didn't work at all, we would have discarded them long ago. But the Buddha saw that a lot of our strategies don't work as well as they could. For example, there's a habitual strategy to avoid even thinking about suffering. You do anything you can to put the thought of suffering out of your mind, the idea being that if you avoid thinking about it, pay it no attention, ignore it, it'll go away. And there may be a few cases in life where that works, where focusing on your pains makes them worse, yet there are so many cases where it works only for a while, and then it breaks down. But because we're used to this approach, used to this strategy, we feel a lot of resistance to even listening to the Buddha's first noble truth. This is why there's so much misunderstanding about the first noble truth as well. People think that the Buddha says that life is suffering. Then they think, that's not true. I don't believe that. There's plenty of joy in life. Actually, there's no place where the Buddha said that life is suffering. It's amazing how many people, even scholars and Dhamma teachers, believe that, but that's not what he said. He simply said that there is suffering in life. You can't argue with him there. And he points out all the obvious sufferings we live with. Birth is suffering, all the pain that goes into being born and giving birth. Aging, illness, and death. These are all suffering. Being separated from what you like, having to live with what you don't like. Then he summarizes his definition of suffering with the 5 clinging aggregates. This is where he starts getting technical, and where he starts attacking another one of our common strategies, which is our sense of self. This is another one of the Buddha's great insights, that our sense of self is an activity, a strategy for avoiding suffering, for maximizing happiness. We latch on to certain things and say, "This is me. This is what I have to watch out for. As long as I watch out for this, maximizing the happiness and well-being of this thing, that'll provide the happiness I want." This way of thinking is an activity, a strategy. It works to some extent, but then there are areas where it breaks down because the things we latch on to are all impermanent. No matter how much time we try to dress them up, fix them up, keep them going, they ultimately break down. Form, feeling, perception, thought constructs, even sensory consciousness. They all break down. But we're strongly addicted to this approach, to hanging on to them as ends in themselves. Which is why, again, we spend so much time misinterpreting what the Buddha said. The Buddha says there is no self, we think, but he can't be right. We're not looking at what he's actually saying. He's saying your sense of self is a strategy, an attempt to maximize happiness and minimize suffering. To some extent it works, and he actually has you use your sense of self as part of the practice, teaching you to be self-reliant, to look after your true self-interest, in other words your long-term welfare and happiness. His teachings on generosity, virtue, and the development of goodwill, all the things that come under the category of merit, are skillful ways of employing your strategy of self. Basically, he has you take your sense of self, your sense of a continuing identity, not only in this lifetime, but also even into other lifetimes, and shows how to work with it intelligently, so that you're not causing harm to yourself, you're not causing harm to other people. You're creating the conditions for a relatively reliable happiness in this world and on into the next. He also uses the development of goodwill, immeasurable goodwill, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity to clean up one of the major problems we have in this sense of self. Our sense of responsibility, knowing that in the past we've done things that are not all that good, and that the results will come back to haunt us. He has us develop these sublime attitudes, these immeasurable states of mind, as means to allay our fear of the consequences of those unskillful actions. As he says, don't let yourself get tied up in remorse. Focus on the present moment, resolving not to make the same mistakes you made in the past, and at the same time develop an attitude of limitless goodwill, because within a mind like that, the impact of past bad actions gets weaker and weaker. The more limitless your goodwill, compassion, appreciation, and equanimity, the weaker the impact of past bad actions. So in all these cases, giving, virtue, the development of goodwill, he takes your sense of self and tries to get you to use it intelligently. That's a strategy for maximizing happiness. Ultimately, though, self as a strategy can only go so far. This is where the not-self strategy comes in. Look at the various things you hold on to, this activity of creating a me or a mine. Exactly what are you creating it out of? Look at the raw materials and you'll see that they can't possibly be you. They can't possibly provide true happiness in the ultimate sense because they're so unstable and inconstant. They're all stressful because they're all fabricated. They're made, they're intentional. And intentions are inconstant. When the cause is inconstant, how can a result be constant? This analysis, though, goes against the grain. But hopefully, by the time we come to it, we've been practicing the Buddha's teachings, especially the ones on generosity, virtue, and goodwill, and our confidence in the Buddha's teachings has grown. Our standards for what counts as true happiness have become more refined. Particularly as we develop our powers of concentration and get used to a more and more refined sense of ease, a more expansive sense of ease, we grow more discriminating in our taste, in our appreciation for what true happiness can be. And there comes a point where we're willing to uncloud our minds and say, well, maybe the Buddha is right. Maybe if we let go of these things we won't be burdened by them. This is what the not-self strategy is all about. Learning how to let go of all the makeshift things we cling to in order to find the greater happiness that comes from letting go. So he takes us step by step, starting with our normal desire for true happiness. He says to focus on happiness, focus on what needs to be done for happiness, but also be aware of the limitations of how you've been looking for happiness. As you get more sensitive to those limitations, you can uncloud your mind to want something more refined. That's where he offers you more refined techniques, more refined strategies. So in that sense, it's a seamless practice, but when we're immersed in the practice it doesn't seem seamless at all. Our minds go back and forth. We seem to advance for a while and then retreat, advance and retreat, go left, go right and all over the place, because some of the Buddha's strategies go so strongly against our old habits. The mind tends to rebel. So we have to learn how to be patient with it. As with anyone overcoming addiction, there are going to be ups and downs. But if you're patient enough, sensitive enough, and rely on your powers of perseverance, they see you through. You become more mature in understanding your desire for happiness. After all, we really do want true happiness. It's not an artificially induced desire. It's something that already underlies all our action. What we're doing is putting the mind in a position where it has a better and better chance of gaining that kind of maturity. It's finally willing to give the Buddha's approaches a try, to replace our old strategies which have had some success, but not total success, but to which we're so attached with new strategies that promise something more. Although those new strategies may initially seem counterintuitive, they make more and more sense as you get to know them. And they really do give results. The promised results. A happiness that's unconditioned, because that's the only kind of happiness that can last. Conditions. Where do conditions come from? Ultimately, they come from our intentions. And what are our intentions like? Well, you've seen your intentions, they go up and down, backwards and forwards. Even when you try to make them constant in concentration, you find that even the most refined states of concentration have their ups and downs. In this way the Buddha has you cornered. You let go of the grosser forms of happiness, the grosser strategies for happiness, and get used to more and more refined ones. And they finally take you to the point where there's no course left but to let go of strategies. All strategies. It's like painting yourself into a corner. The only way to get out of the corner is not to be anywhere. When you can manage that, you see that what the Buddha taught was right. He really knew what he was talking about. This is the way to true happiness. Trust in heedfulness. May 25, 2004. The Buddha's last words were to become consummate through heedfulness. Being consummate, of course, means developing the path to its fullness, so that it can take you all the way to release. And the way to do that, he said, is through being heedful. The Pali word is appamatana. It's interesting, that word heedful. It's not one we use very much in ordinary everyday language. And all the other words that could be used for translating appamatana by being vigilant, by being non-complacent, these aren't words we use in everyday language, either. They're perfectly good words, we know their meaning, but in terms of our active vocabulary, they tend to disappear. We'd much rather hear the word trust, being trustful. We'd like to be able to trust in certain things. Trust that our innate nature is wise, our innate nature is to be awakened, and that we can trust in our nature to take care of these things for us. But that's not what the Buddha taught. He didn't say anything about innate nature at all. The only thing he assumed about people is that they want happiness but are ignorant in how to go about it. This is why he said that you have to be really careful, you have to be watchful, you can't be complacent. There are dangers to your happiness out there. And there are dangers in here as well. In fact, the dangers out there come from the dangers in here. If you're not careful, the dangers in here are going to take over and drown you. So you have to be heedful, you have to be watchful. The Buddha once said that all skillful mental qualities are rooted in heedfulness and have heedfulness as their leader. It's because we're heedful of the dangers that we arouse the energy needed to develop skill in the mind. We see that we're suffering, that we're surrounded by suffering, and a lot of suffering lies ahead of us if we're not careful. It's through being careful, through being heedful, through not being complacent, that we can do something about it. That's the important message here. We can do something about this suffering. Aging, illness, and death are lying in wait, and they're not pretty things. Sometimes you hear people saying that we shouldn't badmouth aging, illness, and death, that there's a beautiful side to them as well, like a lovely flower that's wilting. It has its own kind of beauty. But being a person isn't like looking at a flower. It's a miserable experience being an aging person, being an ill person, being a dying person. Look at all the indignities, all the suffering, all the pain and anguish that serve no purpose at all. They just load you down. It doesn't seem to serve any purpose that we have to die with a lot of pain, or have our bodily functions leave us one by one, so that we're totally dependent on other people. It serves no purpose, but that's the way things are. Some people might say that trying to get out of this suffering is being aversive to life, but it's being realistic. And it's being true to our hearts. We don't want to go through all that needless suffering. And the Buddha says there's a way out. When there's a way out, that means that trying to find the way out is not being aversive, it's being intelligent. As with any danger in life, if you see a way out of the danger, you take the way to safety. Here, though, the safety is something we have to find in our own minds in the midst of the qualities that we can't trust within ourselves. Our laziness, our complacency, our willingness to put up with second best, our desire to turn the responsibility over to somebody else, either a great teacher, some divine being, or just hope that the way of the world will take care of us. But look at the way the world is. I went to Alaska years back, one of the last real wildernesses remaining in this country, and was impressed by how implacable it was. The wilderness would not give one damn if I died. If I died nicely or if I died a miserable death, it wouldn't care. Being surrounded by all that indifference was a sobering experience. That's the way of nature. Animals die. Before they die, sometimes they go through a lot of pain and anguish and terror, all alone, with no one to sympathize, no one to comfort them, no one to help. Nature doesn't care about any of us at all. So it's up to us to make the difference, to make sure that we're not going to suffer from those things, and that means we have to be very watchful, very heedful, because as I said, the danger comes from within. We have this tendency to get sloppy. We're meditating and things get good for a while, and so we get careless, inattentive, complacent. These are precisely the qualities that are going to do us in. When things go well, we have to keep reminding ourselves that they could get worse, but they can also get better. How do they get better? Well, for one thing, when you get a good state in concentration, you try to maintain it. Do what you can to keep it going. This requires skill, knowing how to hold on to it not so tightly that you squeeze it to death, and not so loosely that you lose it. Like holding a hummingbird in your hand. If you hold it too tightly, it'll die. If you hold it too loosely, it'll fly away. You have to watch and see precisely how much pressure is just right. It's interesting. The Buddha never defines the term heedfulness or appamata in the canon. But he does give instructions on how to be heedful, how to develop heedfulness. Realizing that the problem comes from within, he says that the first place you've got to look is in your intentions. Before you sit down to meditate, before you do anything at all, he says, look at the quality of the intention. Is it going to be skillful or not? If it's not a skillful intention, don't act on it. If it is skillful, be clear about it. As when you're meditating, sit down and remember that you have a purpose for being here. Remind yourself of that purpose every time you meditate. This is why we have the chanting in the evening before we meditate as a group. When you're meditating on your own, take the time to remind yourself, why am I meditating? There are a lot of dangers here in the mind. You've got to learn how to sidestep them, how to cut through them. So be clear about what you're doing. Don't just go through the motions because you've scheduled X number of periods to sit during the day, and you're just putting in time. Be careful. Be diligent. Be scrupulous in what you're doing. And scrupulous in checking for the results. That's the other side of heedfulness. When you do something that you think is going to work out well, look at the results while you're doing it, and after it's done. Be honest about the results. What kind of results are you actually getting from the practice? What could you change to get better results? This principle applies all the way from initially getting used to the principle of karma, getting used to the principle of being a responsible person on the external level, and going all the way through into the very refined states of concentration. Even when the Buddha talks about emptiness, what he says follows the same pattern. Be clear about what you're doing. Once you can maintain a good state of concentration, the next step is to look at what's going on. In what way is this concentration empty of prior disturbances? In what way is there still disturbance in it? And where? If you look carefully enough, you find that the disturbance is related to something you're doing. The way you're creating that state of oneness in the mind. The oneness itself is a disturbance, it's an intention based on a particular perception. So what do? If you let go of the oneness, if you go back to having your mind scattered all over the place, that's not skillful. The skillful thing is to go forward to more subtle states of oneness, based on more subtle perceptions. In other words, when you see that the way you're focused on your object is causing stress, learn to focus in a way that's less stressful, that causes less disturbance to the mind. You can pursue this principle all the way through the various levels of concentration, even to the objectless concentration of awareness, where you've let go of the oneness, where there's no specific perception at all. It's almost as if you're not intentionally meditating, but the mind is centered. It's simply that it doesn't have a particular theme or object for its center, not even a formless one. And even there, the Buddha says to watch it carefully. If you look at it really carefully, and this takes very subtle, very intent powers of observation, you begin to see even there's an element of fabrication. Intention. It's willed. So you learn how to drop that, realizing that it wasn't the underlying principle of the nature of the underlying awareness of reality that you thought it was. To see this requires that you be wary about what's going on. That's another translation of appamata. Wariness. Not so wary that you're not willing to get into the concentration and work at developing it. Wariness here means that once you've done the work to get into concentration, you don't get complacent about it. You don't allow yourself to be deceived about it, to think that it's more than what it is. This is your protection in the practice, to make sure that you don't overestimate what you've got, you don't settle for second best, you don't leave yourself open to the dangers out there and in here. So what heedfulness comes down to is being very clear and very scrupulous about your intentions, about what you're doing, and the results that you're getting. If you see that the results are not up to par, ask yourself, what can you do to change what you're doing? Be honest about it. This principle of honesty is what underlies the whole principle of being heedful and non-complacent. The Buddha once said this was his one prerequisite for someone he would take on as a student. Bring me someone who's honest, he said, and no deceiver, and I'll teach that person the Dhamma. So we have to learn to make ourselves trustworthy people, because no matter what promises you get from outside, the test is inside. This is another function of being heedful. Learning to test things, test yourself, test particular practices as they're recommended to you. When insights arise in your meditation, you can't be complacent, believing that everything that arises in a still, expansive mind has to be true. You've got to test all your insights. No matter how impressive the insight, the vision, whatever. Only when things pass the test can you have a really secure sense of what you can trust and what you can't. We'd like to think that all the teachings out there are simply different ways of getting up to the top of the same mountain. You can choose whichever you like because all of them are guaranteed to work. But they're not. Just as all rivers don't flow into the ocean. Some of them, the Severn, the Humboldt, flow into the Great Basin and just disappear. So how are we going to know what works? We have to test things. We have to put ourselves to the test and keep reminding ourselves that no matter how good things get in the meditation, we have to be wary, we have to watch out, because the ability of the mind to deceive itself is so pervasive, so prevalent. The only way we can get beyond that self-deception is by being very scrupulous, very careful, very clear about what we're doing. It's a quality the Buddha called by different names: ardency, alertness, intentness. But it all comes down to being heedful. This is what sees us through. This is why the Buddha made heedfulness his last message, because this quality will get all the good results we want. He could have ended his teaching career with some nice platitudes about emptiness or nirvana or the deathless. But there was no need for that. He said that if you work on this quality of non-complacency, that's what's going to get you there, and then you can know nirvana and the deathless for yourself. So heedfulness is the heart of the practice, the heart of the teaching. And it's aimed at giving our heart what it really wants. The heart doesn't want to be life-affirming, it wants to be happiness-affirming, affirming that there is a true happiness, that there is a deathless happiness, something we can really trust. That's what we really want. So this quality of self-honesty, willing to test things over again because you're not complacent, because you're wary and heedful and vigilant, is what's going to see you through. It's what's going to deliver release. Single-minded determination. June 15, 2004. We're here for the sake of true happiness. That's why the Buddha left his palace and went out into the wilderness. He wasn't satisfied with the happiness that comes in normal everyday life. He wanted a happiness that was dependable, a happiness really worth all the effort that would go into it. All kinds of happiness require effort in one way or another. The question is the effort worth it? In terms of fabricated things, conditioned things, many times the answer is no. In fact, if you make any conditioned thing an end in and of itself, the effort isn't worth it, for ultimately it will leave you high and dry. Yet the Buddha realized that conditioned things have another side as well. Not only are they conditioned, they're also conditioning. In other words, as conditioned things, they're dependent on other causes. They arise and fall in line with those causes arising and falling away, sometimes immediately, sometimes over time. But then they themselves give rise to other things. The Buddha's major discovery was that even though certain things are conditioned, in other words, the elements of the path are conditioned, they can lead to an opening to the unconditioned. And this is what makes the path worthwhile, what gives hope to our lives. In Thai there's a term for the state of mind where all you can see is the bad side of conditioned things. Everything passes away, passes away, passes away, and everything starts seeming hopeless, pointless. It's called narrow equanimity, small-minded equanimity. In other words, you get disenchanted with everything, but the disenchantment doesn't lead to the opening to the deathless. You stay stuck there on the disenchanted side. If you stay stuck there, it's easy to get hopeless, apathetic, depressed. But the Buddha pointed out another side to conditioned things, too. A potential for true happiness lies here in the practice. We're fabricating conditioned things. Right view, right resolve, all the way down to right concentration. These are all conditioned things. They're the highest of all conditioned things. But even though they're the highest, you don't stop there. They're a path. They open up to something even bigger. So make sure that you look at life from both sides. In other words, you're focused on the drawbacks of taking conditioned things as your goals so that you don't get complacent. Sometimes it's easy. You get a nice calm state in meditation, life around you seems pretty effortless, and it's very tempting, and this happens to many meditators to say that this is fine enough right here. It's in cases like that the Buddha points out all the drawbacks of conditioned things, all the drawbacks of conditioned happiness. Not only is a lot of effort wasted in creating that happiness, but sometimes in order to maintain it, you also start doing things that go against the precepts, that go against the principles of morality, concentration, and discernment. So that your conditioned happiness causes suffering not only in passing away, but also in leading to all kinds of bad things down the road. So you have to watch out. You can't be complacent. On the other side, the Buddha emphasizes the fact that heedfulness really does pay off. If everything were negative, then no matter how heedful or careful you might be, then there'd be no chance for any true happiness. But skillful action does pay off. That's why heedfulness is so important. If you're careful, if you're circumspect, it'll make a big difference. So we have to ask ourselves, what kind of happiness are we going to pursue in our lives? And we have to be single-minded in the practice, because it's so easy to stray off in other directions. Some of the side roads are blatantly bad, and others are relatively good. With the good ones, it's easy to talk yourself into saying, well, this is a good thing to do. There's nothing wrong with doing this. In a general sense, yes, that may be right. But if it's second best, if it's not all the way to the unconditioned, you can't let yourself stop there. You can't turn off the road there. You've got to be careful to stay on course. The problem is that we come to the practice with many minds. We don't have any single-minded determination. Ajahn Mun in his last Amma talk referred to single-mindedness as being the essential element in the practice. The single-minded determination not to come back and let the defilement step all over you as before the determination not to come back to suffering. But that determination is something that we have to develop over time. We don't come into the practice this way. We start out with 2 or 3 minds about the whole thing. This is what training the mind is all about. Getting the mind to gather around that single-minded purpose, that single-minded intention. This kind of training starts with the precepts. They show us exactly where our minds are many-minded. When you observe the precepts, you have to focus on your intentions all the time. As you get to know your intentions, you begin to realize that the mind is like a committee. Sometimes it's not just a committee, it's a whole crowd. Even concentration is not the kind of single-mindedness we're talking about, but it's a basic prerequisite. It's part of the training that takes you there. We take one intention and run with it as far as we can in the face of the inevitable contrary intentions that counteract it. In the beginning, the intention to stay with the breath, to stay with the meditation, is bound to be weak, and it's easy to get knocked off course. But as you begin to feel at home here, at ease here, you grow more resistant to getting knocked off because you don't want to leave what you've got. This feels like the right place to be. Then you can start taking on the more deep-rooted intentions that come your way. You take them apart to understand, why do they seem to have such force? You overcome distraction, You overcome the defilements of the mind not by pushing them away and pretending they're not there, but by understanding them. And understanding means the ability to watch them from a good solid standpoint. That's what concentration is for. As things keep coming up, you realize, this isn't really an intention I want to abide by, and that's not either. So you cut them away, until you run into the really big defilements, the really important ones. Sometimes they'll knock you off base again, which is a sign that your concentration and insight need further development. The path of practice is not a smooth straight line on a graph. It has its ups and downs. It has its drama. As you learn in any writing class, one of the basic principles of story construction is that a story has to have setbacks in order to be interesting, in order to be realistic. In the same way, the story of your practice of the Dhamma is bound to have setbacks, the difference being that you're not reading it, you're living it, and many times you'd rather not experience the interesting setbacks. But keep reminding yourself of why you're here. You're here for true happiness, genuine happiness, a happiness that's not going to let you down, a happiness that's going to be worth all the ups and downs that go into finding it. When you look at all the other happinesses you gain from getting off the path, you see that they all let you down in one way or another. This realization helps pull you back on the path, so that ultimately you can start cutting through the big distractions, the big defilements. But whether the defilements are big or small, they require a similar practice, a similar technique. You see where there's stress, you see what you're doing to cause that stress, and you see that you don't have to do that. You can stop, you can let it go. This is the basic pattern. It's simply that with stronger powers of concentration, stronger mindfulness, stronger alertness, you can cut through things that you couldn't cut through before. Over time, that single-minded determination not to let yourself suffer gets stronger and stronger, plays a larger and larger role in the committee discussions until finally it's the voice, the unanimous voice in the mind. All the other voices have been eliminated. Either that or they've been converted. But even when there are still a few traitorous voices lurking in the background, remember that the important voice is this one, the one resolved not to stop short of genuine happiness. Try to strengthen that voice as much as you can, because that's the voice that saw the Buddha through. Look at all the setbacks he encountered in his practice. Finding teachers and then realizing that they couldn't take him all the way, going as far as austerities could take him, and then realizing that that didn't go all the way either. And then he was stuck. He had tried all the alternatives that had been suggested in his culture, and they hadn't worked. But he was determined not to give up. That's what saw him through to awakening. Whatever there is of that determination in you is what's going to give you the strength to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and keep on going. So make sure that that determination stays nurtured, for that's what'll see you through. This is the end of this episode. We will seeing you on our next episode. In accordance with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this extensive 1,000-page book into an easily accessible audio format. It's now your turn to contribute to this noble cause. By subscribing, liking, and sharing this content, you actively participate in the spread of these teachings for the benefit of others. Together, we uphold the tradition of sharing knowledge and mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. Join us in this endeavor, and collectively, we can bring about a profound impact in the lives of many.